This is my best guess on the murder site for Jim Daws, who was killed November 22nd, 1971. He was driven outside of town by Billy Birt and Billy's friend and brought here to a dirt road called Mulberry Road overlooking the river. A lot of this I'm basing off of guesswork. This is a river that crosses Mulberry Road, and apparently Billy Birt and Billy's friend, also Billy, had him here on the bridge and were beginning to torture him with some kind of coat hangers. And they were trying to find the location of the money because he'd only revealed where $1,500 in the house was because the two Billys were already tearing his place apart. He knew that his time was limited, and so they had him out here, and it seems like they probably roughed him up for quite a bit of time before he leaned over and jumped in the water and sank to the bottom. And that's the only reason his body had been found, because usually the Dixie Mafia would slit your stomach open so the gases wouldn't build up over time. It's fascinating to think if they had cut his stomach, he probably would never have been found. There might be more bodies in here, who knows? What's interesting about this, it's only about 10 minutes away from Billy Birt's house, just outside of downtown Winder. So to commit a murder here was pretty brazen. Now in the last video, I talked about where Billy Birt committed his first murders, and I got a little bit of pushback because apparently I didn't get the right bridge. If anybody knows where this actually happened, I'm just doing my best guess. I know it was along this road. I know back when it happened, the road was dirt. And I know it was across a bridge that was over a river, so I'm finding the nearest location I can to it. But if you know the true location, feel free to leave a message in the comments. And again, I apologize for any inaccuracies in this video. I'm doing my best, guys. You can see right there behind us is the county courthouse, and we are heading right now to the old grocery store of Jim Daws, who featured pretty prominently in the story of Ruth Chansy as the queen of the Dixie Mafia. He owned a store which would sell sugar to a lot of these guys involved. ATF Special Agent Jim West and tons of federal agents began to pour into the community around Monroe, Georgia in the late 1960s. West had already busted the largest moonshine ring in Florida and was renowned in ATF circles for it, so they reassigned him to take down the Dixie Mafia. However, it seems like Agent West didn't really care about protecting local witnesses. Billy Birt held a personal grudge against him because he'd promised $1,000 and federal protection for anybody who would give info on the location of moonshine stills, but he never delivered this, essentially forcing Billy Birt to carry out hits on behalf of the moonshiners. Billy Birt thought that even though he was a Fed, he could at least show some sense of honor, which he clearly didn't have. It was around this time that the sheriff approached this man, Jim Daws, or James Daws, and encouraged him to bring his information to Agent West. This sheriff struck while the iron was hot, realizing that Daws had just been in a nasty divorce with Ruth Chansy, the Dixie Mafia's queen. Mostly despite her, Daws told the ATF all about how the Mafia would use his grocery store to purchase sugar in bulk. He named names and implicated many people. Agent West mostly ignored his protection, and the local sheriff felt guilty, realizing he would die very quickly if he didn't help, so he posted deputies around his home. But on November 22nd, 1971, the deputies protecting him left 3 hours early to be with their families for Thanksgiving, and the Dixie Mafia insiders who'd heard Agent West bragging about this approached the house. They called Ruth Chansy's son Harold, and Harold called Billy Birt and dispatched him to kill James Daws. And for decades, that was the story. He was killed because he informed on the Dixie Mafia and their sugar operations. The truth, however, is a little more complex. After the Red Clay podcast came out, the current sheriff dug for more info. It was revealed that Billy and Ruth had different motives for killing him. The Dixie Mafia all knew he was a snitch, but decided that actually murdering him would bring unwanted attention. However, on a friendly visit to Ruth's house, she showed Billy Birt how badly she'd been beaten by Daws and asked him to kill the informant, but to not tell her son Harold. Days later, Billy was driving with Harold, who asked him to kill the man who beat his mother, ironically begging him to hide the truth from Ruth. Seems like everybody wanted Jim Daws dead. In those 3 short hours that sheriff's deputies were gone, Billy Wayne Davis and Billy Birt both teamed up and dressed up in black suits, pretending to be FBI agents. Billy Wayne Davis especially was much taller than Billy Birt, so he stepped forward and presented a fake FBI badge to Jim Daws. When he opened the door, he invited the FBI agent in and revealed that Billy Birt was there, and Jim knew that his fate had been sealed. They took his car out to Lake Lanier and dumped it, tied 3 cinder blocks around his legs, and when they were trying to torture him to reveal the location of more money, because he only showed them where $1,500 was in the house, he jumped over the edge with the cinder blocks on his feet, knowing that he would be tortured to death if he didn't release the info on his money. I should point out that his first wife is buried here beside him. Carolyn Daws was a lieutenant and a nurse in World War II. As Jim's first wife, she probably was abused very heavily and died in 1968 as the result of a car crash. Obviously, this should be considered very suspicious because the Dixie Mafia had an MO of killing people in fake car crashes. And if you'd like to find their graves, they are over here at the Westview Cemetery just outside of downtown Monroe. Welcome to Monroe, Georgia. We are here downtown to talk a little bit today about the Dixie Mafia and some of the assassinations and murders that happened throughout the 1970s and 80s. There's actually some pretty interesting ties here with Ruth Chansy as well. The very famous Chansy trial was held here, and this included the son of the so-called grandmother of the Dixie Mafia, a man named Harold Chansy. Drug in were his other accomplices, Bobby Goswick, Charles Cagle, Audie Jordan, and others, although the charges against these other men were dropped in 1983 as authorities chose to focus on these 3 men in particular. There were other charges brought against Goswick, alleging that he murdered 5 children in a racially charged arson in late 1976, although there's a little bit more to that story, and I'll give details from the unmarked graves of the 5 children, only a 2-minute drive away from this courthouse. It should go without saying that the mood here in Monroe was very tense. The courthouse was packed to capacity, there were spectators outside, and snipers were stationed on the roof of the courthouse and on the surrounding buildings. Legal proceedings discovered that the operations that the Chansys were running, mainly with drugs, began sometime around 1977. Her son Harold and his accomplice, Cagle, would buy up huge quantities of cocaine and marijuana and sold them across a vast drug empire that covered Georgia and Florida. The money would be washed through their rental properties, which they rented out to poor families. They also would regularly commit insurance fraud, and in one case, Ruth took out a new policy 3 days before one of her homes burned. In another case, 2 of her properties burned on the very same day. Because there was so little evidence of murder, the case was mostly circumstantial. Ruth was too sick to show up at the trial, so she was mainly left out of the proceedings, while the 3 men had the book thrown at them for a simple charge of racketeering. They received 20 years in prison each and were ordered to pay a $25,000 fine. Remember when I mentioned the murder charges surfacing at the Chansy trial? They revolved around the October 1976 murder of 5 members of the Thomas family. Harold Chansy's ex-girlfriend made a courtroom appearance alleging that Ruth Chansy, Harold's mom and the queen of the Dixie Mafia, became enraged when she found out they were renting to such a large black family. She suggested that the house be burned for the insurance payout, which was routine practice for the Dixie Mafia. In spite of her supposedly racist attitude, the idea of murdering them never really crossed her mind. The charge was that Bobby Goswick burned the home to collect $40,000 in insurance money, but the fire spread too quickly to allow everyone to escape. James Thomas Sr. and his wife stumbled out of the burning home not too far away from where the Hitachi automotive plant now sits, but their 5 children died in the blaze. Bobby's attorney got him out of these charges and later became mayor of Columbus, Georgia. The 5 children were buried in unmarked graves in this cemetery just down the way from the courthouse and the Monroe water tower. We're here at the site of the old State Farm at 423 West Athens Street in Winder, where Billy Birt decided to murder Tom Locke. Tom owned the office, which Billy used to cover his vehicles. Billy wrecked his Torino after about a week of having it insured. The story there goes that he had bet $500 on a 1-mile race down the highway, but a farmer backed his tractor up, forcing Billy to swerve through a barbed wire fence. When he went to Athens to buy another car, he decided to come back to the state farm and get an insurance check for his Torino. Apparently, Tom Locke kept him waiting in the lobby for 30 minutes, which already upset Billy. And keep in mind, he lived down the road, and everyone in Winder knew to absolutely never cross Billy Birt. Tom told him he wouldn't get paid because he hadn't been insured long enough, and when Billy tried to argue, Tom said, "So sue me," and kicked him out. The next night, Billy dynamited the business, totally destroying it. He wanted to give Tom some time to think about his decision and was actually anticipating a check. But Tom rebuilt a month later, having never paid a dime. The morning of the first day of opening, cops found him in his office, shot 3 times. The coroner, no surprise here, ruled it a suicide, and Birt would later say that it technically was because he knew he was a dead man when he refused to pay even after having his office dynamited. In the shadow of the old insurance building, you've got the Concord Methodist Cemetery, and like many small communities in Georgia, Winder was built on the site of a Creek village that had been here since the dawn of time, called Snodden. And these early immigrants arrived in the early 1790s, so you can see some of the graves here. This was established in the 1830s, match the style of Scots-Irish immigrants. Very beautiful, and a lot of these are overlooked by historians who visit Georgia. And while we're here in Athens, Georgia, to talk some about the Dixie Mafia, I figured I'd show you a lesser-known historic site, the tree that owns itself. The legend here, which is very popular in the Deep South, is that a Revolutionary War veteran owned a plantation with this tree on it. The original tree probably was grown in the early 16th century, and he thought so highly of this tree that rather than deeding it to his descendants, he deeded the tree to itself. The original tree lasted until the 1940s. When it fell over, acorns were planted, and it still continues to own itself, so no one can cut it down to build a home on the property. And if you want to go to downtown Athens, you can get there through this cobble street. To rewind back to my first Dixie Mafia tour video, I mentioned that it was formed as the result of the foolish assassination of a local solicitor by another prominent crime lord. Well, this is where that meeting happened, the Night Owl Lounge. It was here that the highest profile crime families met after the dynamite assassination and agreed to share info and cooperate so they could avoid the media scrutiny they were currently experiencing in the fallout of the killing. To recap why they did this, Cliff Parks ordered solicitor Floyd Hoard killed because of his war against moonshiners, but he acted recklessly and brought unwanted attention to a loose collection of families who had no interest up until that point in cooperating. Billy Birt actually declined a request to assassinate Hoard on Cliff's behalf, but he kept his mouth shut. After all, the only thing dumber than killing the solicitor was informing on the Confederate Cosa Nostra. So in a sense, the old Night Owl Lounge on the road from Atlanta to Athens was the sort of United Nations of the Dixie Mafia. It was here that they decided to convene before hits were ordered and to work together to protect themselves. And much of the Dixie Mafia's revenue came from exactly places like this. You can see the old Night Owl Lounge is actually right behind the corner, and the 284, I believe, is still a bar. Obviously not in the hands of the Dixie Mafia anymore. And up here you can see the old Night Owl Lounge is partly occupied by the entertainment center and the pool tables and supplies. Basically, these guys realized that after a weekend let out in Atlanta, you'd have plenty of people leaving the city to go have fun in Athens. And a lot of these buildings, especially the ones back here that are kind of off in the woods away from the main road, you could have gambling tables there. You could shoot the craps, you could play cards, and even though that was sometimes illegal and with sketchy jurisdiction, the police turned a blind eye so long as they got a little bit of money back from the operation. So, very interesting. Most of these places, of course, are gone now. And this is where one of those old bars was in the outskirts of Athens, where the Dixie Mafia would make a lot of their profits. And it warms my heart to see that local teens have turned it into a makeshift skate park. You love to see it.